Hi class, it's Bill Berry picking up with the continuation of the function series. In the first video in this series we talked about parameters. How do you put something in the function's inbox so that it can pick it up and use it within the function? We're going to pick up now and continue that idea, but we're going to talk about how returns from functions work, and then we've got a couple other little topics we can probably slide in here. Let's try. So what happens with returns? What happens when you need to give data back from a function? Many functions, maybe the majority of functions, have as their goal to do some specific work. And that work is often constructed within the function and needs to be passed back to the caller. So in our lazy professor analogy, for instance, when Susie did the get snacks task, she needed to pass back the snacks. When the other student went to get the markers, they needed to pass back the markers, right? So very often there's going to be some sort of result from the function that needs to be returned to the calling program so that it has what it needed out of the deal. So the way that that works is, unlike the parameters, right? We saw parameters work up here in the parentheses, that's great, but to return a piece of data, one piece of data from the function, you say return, and then you put whatever expression will evaluate to that return. Often that's a variable, right? Often it's just going to be a variable name. But you put that at the very end, and then you put a right before the close curly brace. Now this does two things. Return says return control to the other program, right, to the caller. So this jumps out of the function, right? It says, hey, I'm done here, so get back, right? Get back to where you were called, where this function was called. So it does actually cause the return of control to the calling program, and it also takes that expression, evaluates it, and passes back that value to the caller. Right? So let's look at an example of how that would work. We'll write a function called square it, and square it will take one parameter, which is whatever number the caller wants to square. Now we wouldn't really write this because it's so easy for the caller. They would just use the function, but this interior function, but it doesn't matter. We write this function as an example. So within that, notice we could have created a variable and assigned it to the result of this and then returned that. That's fine. Or we can just say return, and then we provide an expression. And that expression is going to be evaluated. So it's going to take the number that they passed in, that the caller passed in. It's going to raise it to the second power, which squares it, right? Now the way that it works is it's going to evaluate this, take the number, raise it to the second power, figure out what the result of that is. Then on the calling end, it's going to replace the entire call to this function, square it. It's going to replace this entire call with the result of that, right? The result of that expression. So in this case, let's say they called square it with 4. 4 is the parameter. That's going to be copied into number in the function side. It's going to say do math.pow, take number, that's 4, raise it to the second power, 4 squared is 16, return 16. And it's going to copy that 16 and replace the entire call that's shown here with this little bracket. This whole thing's going to get replaced with 16, and then console.log is going to log out 16. So you can use the call any place that you could use its return, right? So we know it's going to return some number. We could use square it, parentheses, whatever, any place that you could use a number, because we know eventually it's going to get replaced by the return value, which is going to be a number. So that's the way that you can create a return from a function, and how you can consume or use that on the calling side. Now it takes a second to think about it, but maybe wind that back a little and actually think about it and walk through it step by step with me to make sure you're really clear on how that return is going to work. Now we're going to look at a bunch of examples of how you can use those return functions, but again, anywhere you can use a number, you can use this. All right, so let's go look at it and see if it doesn't explode our brains too much to see these. So here's an example. I say console.log square it 4. Great. It's going to go off, do this thing. 4 is going to be raised to the second power. It's going to be 16. It's going to console.log 16. Great. That works perfectly well. How about here? Document.write 4 squared is, and then it's going to say plus. It's going to go and run that. That's going to turn into 16. This is going to concatenate the 16, and oops, there's going to be no space between the S and the 16. That's all right. It's going to say 4 squared is 16. In this case, I'm creating a variable called my number. I'm passing my number, right? My number in this case is 5. 5 is going to become the parameter on the other side. 5 is going to be squared. It's going to turn into 25. That's going to replace this. So after this line, the variable square is going to have 25 in it. How about this? A variable called square pretty assigned to call square it with my number. My number is still 5. 5 squared is 25. It's going to replace this whole thing with 25, and then it's going to evaluate 25.toFixed 5. So that's going to be 25.00000 as a string, as you remember. And so then square pretty is going to be a string that says 25.00000. Got it? Next one here, same thing. Call square it my number, that's going to become 25. It's going to floor 25. Well, floor of 25 is still 25, but that's still going to work. Then it's going to store it into a thing called result, a variable called result. And this is an odd use, but one that is completely valid. You can call the function and pass it something, in this case 3. It's going to go run the function. 3 squared is going to be 9. 9 is going to return. It's going to take the place of this whole thing, but this is sitting on a line by itself. It's not stored in a variable. It's not used in any kind of display or anything else. So JavaScript is just going to move on. So what did you just do? Well, you just ran a function for no good reason because you threw away the result, right? If it sits on a line by itself. Now there are functions that you want to do that with, right? You can call them and do something because maybe you don't care about the result. Sometimes the result is just ancillary to what else the function does. You can do it. It's not wrong. It's just odd. It's probably not what you wanted. Right? So these are examples of how you can use the returns, but just remember it's going to take whatever the result of it is and replace the actual call with that. Everything that's in blue here is going to be replaced by the result, and then you can move on and use that in your code however you like. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, just so that you know, not every return has to be a number. You can make it a string if you want. So here's another example where somebody passes in the first name, middle initial, and last name, and I create a variable called whole name and assign it to the first name plus the middle initial plus a space plus the last name. So I just concatenate all these together and put pretty spaces in between it, and then I return that. So if I say create a variable called name and call make full name of John J. Jones, this is all going to be replaced by John space J space Jones as one big string. It's going to store it in this variable, and when I document.write it, I'm going to get John space J space Jones. Right? So functions can be of any type. Now, a good practice for you, if you want to try it, we'll do this in class together, is to create a little function called calculate BMI. This is a real calculation. We want to calculate body mass index, and then we want to use it to prove that it works correctly, and so that is a good challenge that you can undertake if you like. But I'm going to move on, so just pause if you want to look at that more carefully. All right, so our last major topic here with functions is going to talk about variable scope and lifetime, and that is where can I see the variable, how long does the variable live, etc. And we have sort of ignored this because we haven't really needed it until we understood functions a little more deeply, but let's take a peek because there's two different major scopes, scope and lifetime of variables in JavaScript. There are some other funny ones, but we're going to ignore them because we're just not ready for them. So here are the two major things that you can do. You can have local variables in JavaScript and you can have global variables in JavaScript. These two scopes are very, very typical. If you study other languages, these are going to be typical of those. And in almost all languages, you're going to get these two scopes. Well, what does it mean? Well, a local variable is simply a variable that is created inside the function. So what does that mean? If you create a variable inside the function, then it's going to create that variable when the function runs, and it's going to be destroyed when the function ends. So when you get to that last curly brace, that variable goes poof. It disappears and is no longer there. It's not valid. It's not defined. It's as if it never even existed. Interesting. Local variables, their scope is and lifetime is focused on the function, right? It exists within the function, not outside the function. So you can use it inside the function, just great, not outside. Parameters, if you're following the thoughts that I've been trying to convey about those, parameters are like local variables that get their values assigned at the time the function is called. Those also count as locals. That means the parameter comes in, it takes its value, it gets used, and then at the end of the function it disappears. It's no longer there, it's not usable, it doesn't exist anymore, it's not defined. So that's local variables. Now, if you have variables that you create outside of a function, those are going to be globals. Those are going to exist throughout the lifetime of the entire script. So you can use those anywhere in the script, and you can also use them inside functions, right? Because they are global, right? That's why the word global, right? They're available everywhere in the script. You can use them in functions, outside of functions, whatever, and when the script is done, right, when the script is finished, then of course it releases all those global variables because it doesn't need them anymore. So local and global, two very important scopes to know about in JavaScript. Now in JavaScript, as I said, there are some others that are interesting, but until you get into creating your own objects, you probably don't care. And in other programming languages, you might have some other variations, but these two are almost always going to be there in any language you study. So let's take a peek at an example to really understand what's going on here and see if we can follow scope and lifetime. So let's look here. We have a variable called scope test, a function called scope test, and we pass it some number. That number, it's going to take that number and raise it to some power stored in a variable called squared. It's going to write out some number, it's going to write out the resulting square, and it's going to return squared, right? Just for an example of stuff. Now let's pick out all of the local variables here. Some number is local. Squared is local because it's got its start here, right? This is where it was created, and this is where this was created. So some number and squared are local, and they're local variables. Great. Now let's follow down here. Out here we create another variable called power, and it takes on the value 2. Great. I make another variable called result. I call scope test, and I pass it a 3. So let's jump up, let's take the 3. 3 comes in, it becomes some number. So some number is 3, squared becomes some number raised to power. Oh wait, well what is power? It's not defined anywhere here, right? In fact, our eyeballs have to go elsewhere to go find it. We have to look for a global to see if there's one of those. If there's not, then this won't work, right? This is going to give an error. But in this case, it does exist. That's one of the reasons we don't like global variables, is because they sort of break the independence of a function. But in this case, it exists. We go find power. Does it exist here? Nope. Does it exist here? Yes, it certainly does. Here's a variable called power. So sure, it's going to take the 3 that it has in some number, raise it to the power 2. This is going to become 9. It's a bad name for a variable because power might be something other than 2. But anyway, squared becomes 9 in this case. I can write out that. It's a local variable. Can write that out. Local variable, great. I can return that. Local variable, great. Like everything works super well within the function. But outside here, not so much. Let's take a peek. I have my result. Now it's going to contain 9 in this particular case. I can certainly write it out. I can write out power because power is right here, right? It's created here. It's a global variable. I can write out its value. But what if I were tried to write out some number? Some number does not exist in this context. It is not defined. You're going to get an error that says some number not defined. You're not going to get anything. Why is it not defined? I defined it up here. Yeah, but that's a local variable. You can't see local variables from here. In fact, they don't even exist at this point. It's as if it never had been created. Same thing here. I can try to use squared, but it doesn't work because that's a local variable up here. So by the time we get here, it doesn't exist. It's as if it never existed at all. So again, to try to make it a straightforward statement, you can use locals inside the function in which they are defined. Inside the function, you can use any globals you have. In fact, globals you can use anywhere in the script. But outside of the function, you may not use function variables, right? Those are local variables. You cannot use them outside because they don't exist at this point. I hope that's starting to clear things up for you about the scope and lifetime, and it is kind of important to understand those things so that you'll be able to debug your errors in your scripts and understand when it talks about things not being defined why. So last thing I'm going to give you is just a list of a couple of resources. In this case, there is a link for some function definitions if you want to look at that. It's not a bad, I kind of like the W3 Schools site, and when it talks about JavaScript, it's a pretty good site for referring to how things work. So that's a resource there that you might want to take advantage of. That brings us to the end, the complete end of our function discussion. So I appreciate you watching these videos, and I hope they've been useful in understanding how these things work. We've covered functions, how you define them, how you pass parameters, how you return values from a function, and also tried to understand the scope of local versus global. So that's a pretty good coverage for a beginning class, and hopefully you'll be ready to move forward and try more with your functions. So thanks for watching this series. There'll be another series for this class. We're almost done though, so stay tuned for some more goodies.